Thank you, and hello. I can't see you up in the balcony, but I could see you when I was off stage there. Welcome. So Creating a Commotion, I run an institute that does a lot of weird things I'm going to be talking about today, and kind of lies at an intersection that is quite very much unique in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to start by giving kind of a lay of the land so you can get a feel for how our work intersects in a lot of different domains. So I'm housed inside a place called the New America Foundation. At first glance, it seems like your traditional think tank policy institute inside the Beltway. We've got a lot of different programs. And the Open Technology Institute is now one of the largest, but doing a lot of weird things. And so we start seeing some really interesting headlines from across the political spectrum. As of yesterday, we got some great news coverage from Fox News, which I never thought I'd be saying. And so I've stuck them right next to Democracy Now! So that Amy Goodman can keep an eye on them. But the reality is this work has kind of garnered a lot of attention domestically, internationally. The internet in a suitcase is something that myself and my team have created. And when I think about what we're most known for, it's on this notion of hacking together some really cool technologies that people are now using to communicate cheaply, effectively, and in a decentralized manner. But what we traditionally have been known for is a lot of the policy work, a lot of the research that we do, a lot of the educational work that we do with key decision makers on the Hill, in the White House, various government agencies. And then we also have this weird thing, this field unit, field operations arm that's actually building and deploying the technologies that we've been creating. And all of this fits together into a team now that's probably around 40 or 50 people working at this intersection between these three different areas. And Arab Spring is an opportunity for us to kind of shine a light on some of the problems inherent when you actually have a realistic view of what's happening in this intersection between policy and technology and real-world implementation. And for us, in particular, it was this idea that we could get away from traditional debates and discussions around things like copyright, which was always about economics, and to start talking about the reality of when you try to create surveillance and monitoring mechanisms, that copyright becomes a mechanism for cleansing out a lot of different content. What Kerry Sherman isn't going to talk with us about is all of the false positives that he has, the fact that the technologies that they're developing and implementing here in the United States for copyright enforcement were used in Egypt and in Libya, are now being used in places like Syria and elsewhere to find people, round them up, and kill them. So what really flips the world on its head actually is that these technologies that we're developing profoundly change the way that all of this operates. So people know, I guess on your left, this famous diagram of the internet. What we developed, the really sloppy diagram on the right, is a notion of what if we built our own networks? And that dates back to 2000, 2001. If you can see it in that slop, you'll see there's things like Pringles interconnecting everything. Because at the time, 12 years ago, the only way we could build these networks was out of things like Pringles cans. And the way I got involved as somebody who had a background in community organizing was that I could brew beer, very important, and I could eat a hell of a lot of Pringles. And so we were able to start thinking about how this would look, what the architecture would look like, such that by 2002 we were building what became known as mesh wireless networks. Now, by 2004, I'd already started work in DC circles from my perch well outside of the Beltway. And I remember distinctly going to the FCC at the time and saying, hey, these mesh networks don't fit in with your notion of the world. In fact, CALIA, this Communications Assistance to Law Enforcement Act, doesn't work for networks where you're not an ISP and you're not an end user. You're something in between. And the response, typical of the United States government, was, that's really interesting. When the technology is real, we might address it at some point. And so about 2 months later, I came back to the FCC with a backpack full of equipment and set up what I was then later told was an illegal ad hoc mesh wireless network inside the FCC building to show them, like, it's here right now and you should probably think about it. And the FCC did exactly what I expected, which was to say, very interesting, now that we know that it's here, we'll study it. Now, at that meeting, there was a person from Department of Homeland Security who took me aside after the meeting and said, well, this could be a problem. And the reality is it very much is. So by 2005, this notion of the traditional model for telecommunications was beginning to break down. So one of the most disruptive elements about something like a mesh network or device as infrastructure network is that all of the devices, I have no idea how many hundreds, probably thousands of devices are probably in this room right now, given the geek quotient here. But the reality is, like, we can't communicate directly with one another right now. The functionality on our cell phones is turned off to allow us to just communicate within this room. Instead, what we have are systems that are this hub and spoke notion. This notion of everything has to connect up through some centralized tower. That's the place where you put your surveillance and monitoring equipment. The reason, of course, why this exists is because that's also the place where you create all the billable moments on these networks. As opposed to a mesh network, or even more so, a mesh network with a heterogeneity of different devices or services or applications, where all of a sudden there's no center. There's no place for monitoring and surveillance. There's no place necessarily to bill everyone for every form of communications that might exist on that network. And it doesn't take a genius to realize this will create problems all over the place. And I call this the rise of the intranet era. That currently we think about communications in terms of how do I connect to that cloud out there, the internet. We don't think about what does it mean to interconnect locally. So let me give you an example. In Detroit, we have a group called the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition that we're founding members of. And that group has been talking locally, thinking locally, creating skills share locally, and now building a network locally, spanning a few square blocks, providing free connectivity to people in the Cass Corridor, folks that simply could not afford connectivity through any other business model. And in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois, here's a slightly larger one. This is now 6 years old, spanning 10 or 20 square blocks. But the profound implications of these technologies you start seeing when you go to places like Europe. Wi-Fi-Net now has about 16, maybe 17,000 nodes spanning an entire region, covering thousands of square kilometers, interconnecting hundreds of different communities, all decentralized, all running off of open source technologies, all creating incredibly low-cost connectivity that doesn't have any center to it. Freifunk or Funkfeuer in Austria, same thing, entire metro-scale network fed directly from the IXP that's totally decentralized and providing free connectivity at the rooftop level to everyone there. And it's not just in these local locations, right? So you've got 9X in Rome. You've got Athens. Athens is really interesting, 3,000 nodes covering the entire metro region, and now expanding Borg-like into the areas around Athens, flipping over to islands off the coast of Greece, and creating a massive network that has 1,000 local services and applications provided on the network, most of which are completely free to use for anyone that wants to access them. In Israel, and a lot of other places around the globe. So you've got everything from Bogota to Buenos Aires. Again, a massive network there, to in Africa, Cape Town, and hundreds, thousands of different locations all around the globe. Now, the implications for this, in terms of telecommunications policy, in terms of low-cost connectivity, in terms of people's ability to communicate regardless of what governments want to do or enforce or prevent, is pretty profound. But I think the real take-home message, if there is one, is that with our work, with the work of a huge number of different groups all around the globe, building on what Peter and others were talking about earlier, that this is actually part of a global movement of people that are working in this area, a global movement of people who are radically transforming the thinking around telecommunications and radically transforming what's possible with technologies that are available right now today. So thank you very much.